What up everyone, Johnny from Jeddle here, and welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to be deconstructing some student responses and providing what I hope is some helpful feedback. So I've had students provide a number of essays, assignments, assessment tasks that they want help with. So I'm going to hopefully be able to clarify some strategies that you can use to improve your writing. So let's get straight into it. Let's have a look at the first response here. Right here, we're looking at a Module A response for textual conversations. So this is going to be based on Plath and Hughes. So if you're studying Plath and Hughes, or you're just studying a comparative study generally, this feedback should be very useful. We're looking at an English advanced pairing for Module A textual conversations. Here's the question. Express how the dismantlement and reconstruction of ideologies, beliefs, and identities over time leads to literary transcendence. So it's quite a wordy question. It's quite jam-packed, but they basically want you to be able to discern what are the key aspects of this question and what are the less important aspects. That's always the first task, right? Can we identify the key words that we should be using throughout the entire essay? And can we see the other words that you might want to pepper in occasionally but aren't as important? If you start to treat every word as absolutely key, what you're going to end up doing is just repeating the question, and that's the last thing we want to do. It's pretty clear here that dismantlement, meaning breaking down something, it's very important in your head as soon as you read these words, and you want to read the question a couple of times, but you want to be giving yourself a synonym, a go-to definition, so that you can understand the question better. And basically, you want to make it easier for yourself to provide an answer to this question by having synonyms and go-to definitions to remind yourself of how you're interpreting these key terms. Okay, so the dismantlement, the breakdown, and the reconstruction, someone rebuilding, redeveloping, reimagining, reframing, to use the words of this particular module description, of ideologies, beliefs, and identities over time, right? So I've highlighted ideologies, beliefs, and identities, and the key thing to be careful with here is not to just relist these ever in your essay. Whenever you're provided a list of things in an essay question, your job is to distinguish between them. It's not to treat them all as one thing and use them as a collective. So nowhere in your essay should you say ideologies, beliefs, and identities. We should never see that phrase glued together. They're glued together in the question, and it's your job to break them apart and talk about what are the relevant ideologies, what are the relevant beliefs, what are the relevant identities, and perhaps how do those terms relate together? How do they relate to one another? So always separate those terms throughout the essay. Never use them together, even though they're placed together in the question. That's going to very quickly distinguish a high-level writer with someone who doesn't actually know how to unpack key terms of the question. Don't feel like you have to use all three of those every time as well. It's okay to focus in on one for a part of the essay, and then maybe you emphasize another one of those words, such as beliefs or identities. Maybe one of those words is more important for your essay overall. That's okay. It's clear that dismantlement and reconstruction are words you want to keep coming back to, whereas words like ideologies, beliefs, identities, they all have a pretty big overlap. Identities is a little bit different, but ideologies and beliefs, ideology, again, if to provide myself a go-to synonym, that just means your way of thinking. So I think of a way of thinking, a perspective, you could say, and a belief is a conviction you have, right? It's something you believe to be true. So they're pretty similar. How you look at the world and what you believe, they link pretty closely. Your identity is how you view yourself, right? Your self-concept. And also it just says, it doesn't say, your self-identity, it says just identities in general. So you can actually link that to things more broadly if that works for what you want to argue. But I wouldn't worry too much about using ideologies and beliefs all the time. You could just focus in on one of those, and identities is kind of its own thing there. And again, like if we use a synonym for identities, we can think of the self, right? How you view yourself. How does that lead to literary transcendence? So this is where it's key to consider the relationship between two texts, and also how one text can actually produce meaning that transcends its particular context. So if Plath's work was produced in the 60s, say the 1960s, what is it about her work and what is it about what Hughes does later in his work that allows her work to actually transcend, again, definition, go beyond her particular context? How does it have new meaning that can be attributed to it later in time? Okay, so we're talking about how a text is still worth studying later in time, and how actually its meaning can be fluid and how it can transform over time, especially when you look at Plath's text through the lens of Hughes's text, right? If we look at Hughes's poetry and then we consider Plath's poetry, suddenly the meaning changes, right? Plath's poetry in and of itself, you could argue, is transcending her own context because it's something we'll continue to study because of the concepts that it explores, right? That universality. You go back to those general principles that you've probably heard when studying literature, and you think, you have talked about how certain themes are universal and they'll continue to be studied, but there are also some very distinctive aspects of a composer's style that makes them worthy of continued literary criticism and study. We also want to acknowledge there with literary transcendence, if we're talking about two texts, this idea of intertextuality. Okay, so how do those two texts affect each other's meaning and interpretation? How do they change the way we look at each text? And how does studying both texts remind us generally of the power of one text to impact the meaning of another? So not just looking at those two texts in isolation, but how does intertextuality encourage us to appreciate the inevitability of transformations in the way that a text is received when you have another text that connects to it, right? Meaning is always changing, and this idea that the truth is impossible to grasp in an objective way is really key to this study. So you want to make sure that you link this idea of literary transcendence with a fluidity of meaning and this idea that the truth is subjective, right? This is a postmodern concept, but the truth as a subjective concept rather than something that is objective and fixed. That meaning is fluid and changes, especially when you have a text that comes later, like Hughes's poetry, which kind of throws a spanner in the works and makes us question and rethink what Plath's poetry was really about. Suddenly, her poetry means something different to what it did before. Okay, enough about this question. That was also just a bit of background about the module and how you can look at that. If we're looking at this student's body paragraph, they are focusing on Plath's Fever 103. Okay, they're focusing on that particular poem, which is fine. You are studying a set of poems. That is the one text. Don't forget that. But you will inevitably have to focus on 2, maybe 3 texts to basically represent your understanding of the whole set of text. So even if you're studying 5 or 6 poems, you can't talk about all 5 or 6 in an essay that is only 900 to 1,000 words. So this student is doing the right thing in picking a particular poem that can then be used as an example of Plath's broader purpose and use of stylistic elements. And then we can connect that to one of Hughes's poems, and we can look at the relationship there. And then we can extrapolate from that and talk about the relationship between their poetry more generally, even though we're only zooming in on a couple of them. So in an essay where you study a set of poems, you will typically just use 2 or 3 as an example of the broader set. So Plath's Fever 103 dismantles. Nice engagement immediately with that keyword of the question. Love to see that, as long as it's done in a specific way. So we're looking for the student to use the word dismantle in a specific way so that it goes beyond the scope of the question. If you just say the word dismantlement, that doesn't actually engage meaningfully with the question. So we're looking for a breakdown there. So what is being dismantled? How is it being dismantled? Why is something being dismantled? Ask yourself those mini questions with respect to each key term of the question, and that will help you go beyond the scope of the question, right? And when I say beyond the scope, it will help you avoid merely repeating the question. If you force yourself to answer an additional mini question, a micro question, a sub question about those words. So what is being dismantled? How is it being dismantled? What type of reconstruction are we seeing? Why has something been reconstructed by Hughes or Plath? If you force yourself to answer one of those questions and write what the answer is in conjunction with the actual word of the question, then you've done a meaningful response to those key terms. So Plath's Fever 103 dismantles her bedridden self. So already the student has actually said what is being dismantled by Plath. So just note that's a really good thing. That's a positive thing that this student has done. They haven't merely used the word, they've gone beyond the word by answering what is being dismantled. I can't emphasize how important that is. That's something that 80–90% of students really struggle to do. They'll use words of the question, but they don't say anything more than that. Okay, Plath's Fever 103 dismantles her bedridden self to uncover the dissolution of her selfhood is what the student had. Just be careful to repeat words, within the same section of the text, it can just sound a little bit clunky. Better off just using a synonym so that you're not repeating self twice within the same sentence here. So uncover the dissolution of her identity. She dismantles herself to uncover the dissolution of her identity. I mean, it could be clearer there. I mean, I just have to take some of this as it is without going too much into the concepts, because I want to stick with the concepts that have been provided here by the students and just focus more on the actual write-in. But the concept there is a little bit murky to me. She's dismantling her bedridden self to uncover the dissolution of her identity. It almost sounds a bit repetitive. Dismantling herself to uncover the dismantling of herself. Just be careful there. Make sure the point is nice and clear in the topic sentence. Stemmed from, I mean, I guess that would have to be stem in from. And you can see here that I've highlighted this part because if you look ahead at this sentence, and this is all the topic sentence, it's very clunky because there are a lot of clauses. A clause is just a section of a text separated by some kind of punctuation, like a comma or a semicolon. But see here, this is a clause because it's between this comma and this comma. The issue here is that after we do the further breakdown here, saying where this dissolution or dismantlement is stemming from matriarchal ascension and patriarchal entrapment, we then say achieved through. So there's another comma now, and we say achieved through, and it's just going to have this kind of clunkiness as we keep repeating, and then we're going to lose meaning. We're going to lose sight of what you're actually saying eventually because there are so many of these additional clauses. So really try and minimize the number of commas that are in your sentences generally, but especially in your topic sentences. Okay, so I would say 2 commas is a kind of good benchmark there. If you're using more than 2 commas to break things down, perhaps you need to restructure the write-in, or you need to eliminate part of the sentence. Like here, you just don't need all of this additional stuff, or at least you might only want to use the last bit here and get rid of something in the middle, but we don't want all these clauses. It gets too clunky. It's not tight, concise write-in, and it's already going to kind of put the marker off there and set the wrong impression about your ability as a writer. Okay, so it's stemming, we're looking at where this dissolution stems from, stemming from matriarchal ascension. Little bit vague there. And the other issue here is you've said it's stemming from 2 things. And whilst it's okay to say 2 things, matriarchal ascension and patriarchal entrapment, it's more meaningful and impactful to just focus on one thing. Focus on one thing. Avoid doing double ups. This is the double up problem. And it's going to happen in basically every response that we look at here for this particular student response and other student responses. Okay, I see it all the time. It's more impactful to just focus on one thing, even if it's true that there is something else that's relevant. It doesn't mean you should just list everything. Okay, save up the patriarchal entrapment point or the matriarchal ascension point for somewhere else in the paragraph. Try and just restrict it to one thing. Otherwise, you are diluting, you are lessening, weakening the importance of each individual thing you're saying there. Because now I'm thinking, okay, it's stemming from matriarchal ascension and patriarchal entrapment. It's a little bit confusing in a sense because you've just said and there are these 2 things and I have to try and distinguish between them. And I'm not really focusing as much on each particular thing. I'm trying to balance my attention between the 2. So try and just keep it tighter and more sharp, punchy by focusing on one thing and avoid the end trap, okay? Avoid too many ends and ors and commas with lists of things in all of your essays. So it's stemming from that, achieved through the mental transcendence. Now, good effort here to go beyond the question by using an adjective before the actual keyword of the question. Remember that transcendence was there. It was actually literary transcendence. So the question already provided the type of transcendence, literary transcendence, the ability for a text, right, a product of literature, to actually go beyond its immediate context. We've kind of changed it here and gone, okay, well, I want to go beyond the question. I don't want to just repeat the question. So the student's gone mental transcendence. It's like, that's not exactly what the question was meaning by that. And this is why it's so important to clarify how you're going to interpret those key terms from the question at the get-go. This is why it's important that you don't just start writing straight away, because it'll become very obvious to a marker that you don't quite get the question, or you're changing your interpretation of the question at different points in your essay. We need to be very clear about how we're going to treat literary transcendence. For me, as I said, that is about a text being able to go beyond its immediate context and for its meaning to change over time. But now we're kind of misappropriating it. We're using it in a way that it wasn't intended in the question. And there is some scope for interpretation. So it's not like there's only one way to interpret literary transcendence, but in this particular instance, it's like we're taking that word transcendence and misapplying it. We're actually using it to say a mental transcendence of Plath. And it just seems like that's going away from what the question meant when it said how dismantlement and reconstruction of identities leads to literary transcendence. If transcendence was used here to actually say, look, it's transcending beyond her own work, or she's trying to elevate her message so that it extends beyond her immediate context or something like that, then yes, you could do that. But it's tricky to use it up front here anyway, because we haven't brought Hughes into the equation yet. And again, I would be applying literary transcendence if we're talking about a textual conversation here in the context of that relationship, not so much with respect to one individual text, especially as if this is your first paragraph of an essay. Just trying to say a bit too much throughout this topic sentence, right? Again, a third clause, prompting vacillations that affect her mentality. Mentality is one of those vague words. It's just not very clear what you even mean by that. You should just say exactly what her psychology is. You should say that once in a specific way and get rid of everything else. So try and cut all of this down, focus on one thing up here and basically cut everything else, right? And if you want to talk about how she does something, you might want to say through some kind of stylistic element, something about how she's written her poetry, or something about how she writes about these frequent milk fevers as a metonym or a symbol for something else, a broader symbol as a key symbol or metaphor. You can say through that, Plath does this, and you would again have that second comma here and then say stemming from patriarchal entrapment. But you might want to be a little bit more specific about that again and eliminate matriarchal ascension, right? These terms that only have one or two words are just inherently vague. So try and break down one of those a little bit further and then end the sentence there. Okay, next sentence. What's good is that this student, unlike other students that I've been having a look at, goes straight into the analysis. Okay, that's great, because some students have been doing 2 or 3 topic sentences effectively in a row, even though it's the same paragraph. They're doing 3 conceptual statements that don't have any evidence. They don't have quotes or techniques, an explanation of those pieces of analysis, right? Explanation of those techniques or quotes, that is. So the analysis should come in after the topic sentence. You might want to bring in context as well as part of that, but I would integrate it so they're not all in separate sentences. It's very important in an essay that you get into the analysis as soon as possible after your topic sentence. You've brought in your concept, now start proving it. Bring in your evidence. They've done a great job here in going into analysis, where they're going to give me a technique, rhetorical question, and they're going to give me a quote showing that rhetorical question. And it's not too long a quote, which is awesome. We don't like long quotes. We like having quotes that are as short as possible to prove the point that you're making and to actually provide evidence of the technique that you have used to label that quote with. But just be careful here with grammar, punctuation. This is all going to be very important in terms of shaping a marker's impression of your writing ability and your work. So here we say, exemplified in her rhetorical question, there's no comma or anything. It just goes straight into the quote. I mean, you would have to at least have a colon there, because you're about to tell me what the rhetorical question is. You would then want to have a comma afterwards, right? So it didn't have a comma after this, even though I know it looks funny there because there was a question mark within the quote, because you needed that question mark to show that it was a rhetorical question. You do still need a comma afterwards, because there would be a natural pause there. Exemplified in a rhetorical question, pure, what does it mean? Plath evokes, see, we have to pause to then say what Plath is actually doing. So the way that this is structured does require a comma there. So just be careful with that. Also note that when the student has brought in the quote here, they haven't kind of integrated it in a seamless way. We always like to use quotes in a way where if you were to remove the quotation marks, the sentence would still flow naturally. This can be really difficult to do, especially when you have a quote like this. Sometimes the quotes just flow really well and you have a nice short quote that can be integrated seamlessly into the sentence so that it has that flow and you don't need to have a colon, or again, a colon are these 2 dots here, and a comma, of course. Like we want to avoid having to even use that. So we want to structure the sentence and word the sentence in a way that it's able to flow into the quote. And you also want to start the quote at an appropriate point where it would also allow you to have that flow. So you can look at kind of manipulating which part of the quotes you're using and the wording before you introduce the quote so that they integrate seamlessly and you don't have to actually pause to then say the quote. So the student hasn't done that here, and we would be trying to reshape it so that we could do it. So what's an example of that? Sometimes you have to add a few words in between the technique and the quote to get that flow happening. So exemplified in her rhetorical question as she contemplates the nature of pure. See how I've added the as? This can be really helpful. So if you've got a technique and then you've got a comma or a colon and followed by the quote, instead of doing that, eliminate that and add as and just provide a little bit of context or just frame it as in a way that says what she's doing. Okay, she's contemplating that. So as she contemplates the nature of pure. See how that actually flows? If I was to remove the quotation mark there, it would still flow nicely. Look to add in words like as and then a word like of before a word like pure. You have to practice with this and get used to different examples to get good at it. But here's an example of how you can create a seamless transition there. So we can get rid of the comma or the colon altogether. Okay, that's going to help improve the sophistication and the flair of your writing. After all of that, we add the comma here. Plath evokes a contemplation. Well, we now would have to change that because we've said contemplates there, but we would just use some kind of synonym there. She evokes a contemplation of her femininity, where her mental stability and aging transcendence, I don't know why there's a comma here, prompts, and I'd probably say whereby, right? She evokes a contemplation of her femininity, no need for a comma there, whereby her mental stability and aging transcendence prompts her to desert her innocence and invite ideas. Now, if this is genuinely moving forward, the end there is okay, by the way, just to clarify when you wouldn't want the end. We don't want an end when you're going to say basically two very similar things next to each other, so as to almost provide a list of nouns or adjectives. It prompts her to desert her innocence and invite ideas of immortality and rebirth. There's an example of where you don't want the end, because deserting her innocence and inviting ideas of immortality, they are two distinct concepts and they relate to one another. So that's okay to use end there. Certainly don't list a number of concepts. I think 2 would be the max, but you can see here, immortality and rebirth, just cut one of those, right? It's diluting, it's taking away from the meaning of each word there, rebirth, immortality. It's confusing to me. Which one are you talking about? Because they're slightly different. Invites ideas of immortality and invite ideas of immortality. Like what ideas as well? It's very vague. What is an idea of mortality? So avoid using words such as ideas, themes, concepts, and instead just say what they are. Same as perspective, right? As long as you say what type of perspective, you can use the word perspective. For instance, you could say a feminist perspective because you're actually defining what the perspective is. But I would really try and avoid using a word like idea and instead just say the idea. Simply using the word immortality isn't an idea. You're not telling me the idea. You're just telling me a theme word, but you haven't told me what the idea behind it is. What, that we're not immortal? That something leads to rebirth? You've actually got to try and say it as a phrase. It's not just going to be sufficient to say one word such as immortality. That's actually not an idea. I don't really know what you mean by that. So make sure you're telling me something specific about one of these. Don't use both. We do have the same issue here where there's a little bit of clunkiness coming in because another comma here and then into another clause, overcoming her past regrets and uncovering Plath's identity. That, I guess it would be uncovering her, because that's going to be really confusing to suddenly say Plath when you've been saying her the whole time. Uncovering her identity that eventually provokes the feminist assault on Hughes. There's just so much in that. So try and figure out what is the one key thing there, and we want to reduce this sentence by one clause, okay? So you might want to use some of this up here. You might want to get rid of mental stability and aging transcendence, because there is the end problem there as well, now that I look back at it. See how common that is? So really try and work on the double up problem and just consolidate that, because you're trying to say too much within one sentence. Worst case, you just split it up and put a full stop somewhere and say, this represents her attempt to overcome past regrets and uncover her identity, right? But we don't want clunky sentences. So you either have to split it into 2 sentences, which can add words, or what I think is probably preferable in most cases is to work out a way of cutting it down to the essential elements of the sentence, going on to the next point. Okay, so second sentence here. Moreover, posing this question to Hughes enables him. Now, I don't know if it enables him. I've changed that to prompts him. And you also had pondering this question to Hughes, which doesn't quite make sense. So I said posing this question to Hughes, Hughes being the other author whose work came out after Plath's, prompts him to reconstruct his own recontextualized perception. Very wordy. Just, I think the key trend we're seeing here with this student's writing is that we're trying to say too much at one time, which means you might not be that certain of your own view as well. You're kind of you're jamming in all these words and concepts, but you're not clearly articulating any one of them specifically. Okay, so you're kind of cramming a lot of things in, but that means you're not actually saying any one particular thing in a very articulate manner. So just work on that. Work on taking away all of these words that are somewhat repetitive and getting rid of the double ups, getting rid of the excessive clauses and long sentences, and just having one clear idea that connects to one piece of evidence that you can say in a relatively short sentence. And that's not going to be easy. It's a hard thing to do. It's easier to do what you've done here. And it's not bad. It's just that it could be better by being more specific about one particular concept. And these aren't even concepts here, like reconstructing his own recontextualize. It's just too wordy. You don't need to be using these. So you need to pick one of those. Let's say it says prompts him to recontextualize his perception on Plath's dismantled, we'll add in his perception on Plath's dismantled purity, where he justifies her mental plights and innate promiscuity. So you can see there the end issue, the double up of mental plights and innate promiscuity. The answer is pick one and make sure you're being specific about it, but you are in this habit of using two words like mental plights and innate promiscuity and putting those together. So try and work on that. Justifies her, you could say mental plights. You pick which one works better for you, as a form of rebellion against his perceived patriarchal authority or even control. Yes, he is trying to resist that, right? As a form of defense, you could even say, would sound nice. I think you've used defense somewhere else as a form of poetic or literary defense. Okay, so we would want to add that in to be a little bit more specific about the type of rebellion. Rebellion is one of those kind of big abstract concepts. Better if you say something like a poetic defense. That is a little bit sharper, it's tighter, it's more specific. And then you go from there. The issue with this sentence, though, if you look at it, there are no quotes, there are no techniques, there's no analysis. So even though you did a good job of going topic sentence to analysis, you've somehow reverted back to another kind of topic sentence mid-paragraph. You've only brought in one piece of analysis, and yet there's no evidence here. You've just added in another concept, another piece of commentary that doesn't actually have any analysis attached. So you won't have time or the word count realistically to be throwing in all of these conceptual statements in the middle of your paragraph. You need to integrate these pieces of commentary and analysis with your evidence so that you're always looking at the stylistic elements in conjunction with the overall purpose and effect. Here, you've just made a general comment about it, but you haven't actually, like that to me wouldn't be a moreover. That to me could be your link sentence at the end of the paragraph if it worked there, or it could change the way you word your initial topic sentence, but I don't think it belongs here by itself. So what I always say is don't necessarily delete it, but merge it and pair it with a piece of analysis, a technique and a quote, or a general stylistic element, and embed a quote in the sentence in order to have that analysis recurring throughout the paragraph. We don't want to go analysis, more commentary, analysis, more commentary. Okay, you want to go topic sentence, analysis, 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 link sentence. Okay, and sure, some sentences might be split into two, but this is an example of one that just feels like a standalone conceptual statement. Okay, next sentence. Plath's metonym, I am a lantern, highlights her ascension and matriarchal metamorphosis into hope. So the issue there is it feels a bit random. It feels a bit isolated. We need to make sure that every time you have another sentence, it's extending on the previous sentence. It doesn't have to extend it in that it's about the exact same idea. You don't want to repeat the same idea ever. Once you've said one idea, you need to move to the next, but it needs to relate to it in some way. when you start a sentence like this, there's no word at the beginning, and that's fine. You don't always have to have like a moreover, a however, a significantly, comma. You don't always have to have that, but you need to have something in this sentence that at least implies or is obvious enough to the marker or the reader that there is a connection with the previous sentence, with the previous point. So just be careful. Like, I like having this structure as a starting point when I'm drafting up analysis. Like, I go straight into the technique. Plath's metonym. I am a lantern. Verb. Highlights. Affect. Her ascension and matriarchal metamorphosis into hope. Then I want to tweak that. I want to refine that. I want to make sure it's flowing on from the previous sentence. I want to make sure that it doesn't feel too structured, because it's just like technique, quote, effect. It's like too in your face in that form, and that can work once or twice, maybe once per paragraph, but you're not going to have as much flair if you just write with that predictable structure. Try and have a little bit more of your own voice, your own style in the way you write it, while still always having those core elements. So you've done a good job of having the elements in there of a technique, a quote, a verb like highlights, and then you've actually said the effect, but you haven't done the refinement and you haven't ensured the progression there. So a couple of things that will improve it. Again, we've got that issue with the comma. We want the quote to flow into the sentence, and we want to make sure we're connecting that technique correctly. Like, I am a lantern isn't a metonym. The lantern itself is the metonym. The whole thing is not a metonym. So you need to be careful with how you word that. Fine to start this way as a first draft, but you need to refine that further. And the other thing is you've done the double up problem of her ascension and matriarchal metamorphosis. Now, ascension is just this one word theme word. Again, it's like a buzzword. We don't want that. We don't need that. I want the concept. I want the perspective. Her matriarchal metamorphosis into hope. That sounds nice. That's a fleshed out perspective. That is not a one word theme or buzzword, right? And hopefully it's clear what I'm saying. So it's a clear pick here. There's a clear winner out of that problem, of the double up problem, right? So we can resolve the double up problem there clear, because we've got this clear winner of a much more sophisticated concept there. Congratulations, matriarchal metamorphosis into hope. Now, how do we get the flow here? How do we ensure a better flow? And how do we ensure we're actually using this technique correctly, that we're not misapplying it to the whole sentence? Well, have a look at this. This is a rewording. Plath's high modal. I've tried to add in a second technique because it works well with the I am a lantern. She's saying with confidence, with certainty, that I am a lantern. So that's high modality, right? That certain definitive tone is high modal. So Plath's high modal assertion, that is key here, because the word that actually helps us get that transition, that seamless transition into the quote. So that is a really powerful word. I've intentionally structured it this way so that we could say her assertion that I am means I don't have to put a comma or a colon there, and it flows. So if I was to take out the quotation mark there, it would still flow if I were to say it aloud. So always read your sentences aloud and check if it flows like a normal sentence with or without the quotation marks. Her high modal assertion that I am a lantern leverages the image of a lantern, right? We're actually deconstructing this quote so that we can properly use lantern. It leverages the image of a lantern. It's okay to repeat that. We're isolating that word out to show that we're really analyzing the quote properly. As a metonym, now we get the metonym. There she is. For her matriarchal metamorphosis into a symbol of hope. Okay, I've added symbol of hope there as well. Probably don't even need to say that, but in any case, that's what it's been changed into. So I think that has more flow, more sophistication, and it's a more proper use, it is a better use of metonym as well. And you also get to have the two techniques that are mentioned, and that's obviously going to elevate the sophistication on a technical level. You're showing the marker that you really understand the nuances of language, all these different language features that are being used together. So it's great if you can have multiple techniques occasionally in your sentences of analysis, as long as you're not listing them. Notice how they are clearly separate in the sentence. We're not just listing three techniques that we see and putting them all together. Never list, always separate, always relate. So this is an example of a two-sentence analysis, which is absolutely fine. Okay, a lot of students do this. I'm not here to tell you that you have to do every piece of analysis within one sentence. I'd say 2 sentences maximum. I am here to tell you 2 sentences maximum. But, and the reason for that is because you just won't have enough time to cover enough analysis within a body paragraph if you're doing 3 sentences of analysis on one quote every single time. Your paragraph is going to be like 2 whole written pages, and you're going to run out of time, and the essay is going to be pretty clunky, and it's not going to be concise. So 2 max, but 1 to 2 is the range. Here she emphasizes that a retribution against her perceived patriarchal oppressors was not necessarily an intentional pursuit for matriarchal empowerment or showmanship. We've got the or. You've gone from N to or, but it's still a double up problem. So we need to solve that. You need to cancel one of those out, or at least reword it in a way where it doesn't sound like you're saying 2 kind of equal things, and it's going to confuse us. Which one do you want to say? A pursuit for matriarchal empowerment, or a pursuit for, not even pursuit for, her intentional, if we cut that underlined bit out, do you want to say an intentional showmanship as a literary performer through her poetry? Decide which one. What's going to make more sense to you? But instead, a self-depreciating? Do you mean self-deprecating? But instead, a self-deprecating undertaking of justice. Okay. I'm just going to read back through. Again, I'm not focusing too much on the actual concepts that the students are providing here. I'm focusing more on how it's all written, right? Because I don't want to go into the concepts. I want to help everyone here so that they can apply all of this to any essay they're writing on any text. But just make sure the concepts are clear. I'll tell you what I like in the argumentative language here. I like that this student has says was not necessarily this, but instead this. I love that kind of language, right? That's very argumentative and it's nuanced. It wasn't necessarily this, but it's this. That shows that you've actually thought about this more deeply. You're not just saying this technique in this quote means this. I like that this shows a considered approach to the text. It shows an awareness of how something might be perceived versus what you believe it to actually be. So beautiful language, right? Thumbs up, A+ for this kind of language. I love this. This is high level stuff, okay? The only issue here is, even though you are extending on the quote that you've provided up here, it still feels a little bit too much like a link sentence or a conceptual statement that doesn't have evidence attached. I know that this is breaking down this earlier piece of evidence, and we said you can do up to 2 sentences, but something that's going to make it a lot stronger, and it's a simple fix, is to actually embed a quote within it. So even though you've got "I am a lantern" as your primary quote that you're breaking down here over 2 sentences, try and integrate some other small 1 or 2 word quotations from Plath's work into this sentence. So you're not using every quotation as an example of a technique, but rather you're actually just working some of the words into your argument, into your explanation, so that you actually show a deeper engagement with the text. So this is the second way you can use quotes. Don't just use quotes as examples of techniques, because that's a bit limited. Try and embed and integrate quotes into your other sentences and clauses and parts of sentences where you're actually explaining a prior quote. Okay, so you can use little 1-word quotes occasionally to replace the language that you yourself would have used or to complement it. Okay, so I'll try and give you an example so it's making sense. But let's say that there's a quote in one of her poems, or in this poem, where instead of saying oppressors, right, she says, say you can find somewhere in her poetry, and sometimes you have to scan through and find appropriate words that could replace something you already said. But say somewhere in her poem was a word, and it can be figurative, it doesn't have to be a direct replacement here. But instead of saying her patriarchal oppressors, say it's her patriarchal captors. Maybe captors was a word you can find somewhere in a poem. Then we would replace oppressors, which you wanted to say, with captors, because it's similar enough, and it's actually better that it's figurative. It adds some flair to this piece. And you replace it with what Plath said. Now, Plath didn't actually say captors, as far as I know. I haven't looked at this particular poem before doing this one. But basically, if you can embed a quote like that, we're not using captors as an example of a technique. Again, we're analyzing "I am a lantern" here. This is an extended analysis of it into the second sentence, but we are embedding a quote here, and we would try and do it 1 or 2 more times perhaps in this sentence. The more you can do that, the more impressed the marker is going to be, because you're actually showing that deeper engagement with the text, with the language of the text, but you're not doing it in a way where it's actually overriding your argument and your language. Like, this is 99% your words, but if you can kind of pepper in these quotes from the text to supplement your explanation of a prior quotation, then you're well and truly on the right path to constructing a sophisticated response that has flair and nuance and demonstrates that deeper engagement with the text. Now, the next sentence says, this perception is further explored in Plath's mythological illusion. Careful with further explored. It's a little bit of a throwaway. It's kind of giving me the impression that you're going to repeat a very similar point. It's almost like if you said similarly and then just provided another example of the same thing. That's not a great response because you've already made that point. You should be extending the point. Now, you might very well extend the point in this sentence, but you're giving me the impression that you're going to say something very similar. So try and avoid language that would even give the marker the impression that you're going to repeat the same point, because you shouldn't be repeating the same point. And again, you might not in fact be repeating the same point, but it's starting to sound like you're going to. So don't do yourself a disfavor there. Don't do yourself a disservice there by using this kind of language, okay? Try and use maybe a word like amplified or extended or is problematized, right? You might even chuck a however in there or something. Make sure the argument's moving forward. Make sure you're adding another side, or it doesn't have to be another side, of course, but make sure you are moving forward with the argument and avoid language that's going to sound like you're being repetitive. Now, the original response didn't have the word to here, but to is another great example, just like I showed you up here with the word that is going to allow us to have that seamless transition between the technique and the quote. So we're saying Plath's mythological illusion to Cerberus, incapable of licking clean. Before, we didn't actually have that. Look at this. It just said, in Plath's mythological illusion, now we have to pause, Cerberus, incapable of that. Not as much flair as having to Cerberus, because now we can say it out loud and it sounds like a normal sentence. Dismantling her momentary reconciliation with herself, comma, face in. So we just have this issue, and a lot of students have this issue, where they're using all these ing words to begin all of these new clauses, and it just gets clunky very quickly. So again, you can see another example of where this student would probably want to either have a full stop here in order to keep the sentence punchy, and then you can break it down further in a second sentence, or work out what else you wanted to say in this sentence and merge it in a way where you're not saying this and this. You're saying this and thus this. Even that can show a cause and effect relationship. Instead of saying and, you can say and thus, and then say that further point. So avoid having another comma after this comma, right? Because you're saying dismantling this, and then you had another comma saying face in this. It's just getting too clunky, and I'm losing sight of the point that you're trying to make. Facing the reality of a mental deterioration, purity and mental plights. Oh my goodness, this is a triple up. We've seen double ups, this is a triple up. I'm being dramatic, but you are listing here, okay? You're listing, and we're trying to avoid listing. You need to focus on one thing at a time in depth. You're just throwing buzzwords out here. Purity, mental plights, mental deterioration. It all sounds great, but actually when I break it down, you're not saying much about any of it. You're just saying a whole bunch of words that are taking up a lot of space, so it gives you the impression that you've said something significant, but actually you've just listed a lot of things that don't have any depth or substance to them. So you need to pick one of those and force yourself to say something more meaningful or specific about them. That's the trick. Facing the reality of her mental deterioration, of her purity. That's facing the reality of her purity. Is that what you're trying to say? Say something about the purity. What about the purity? What about her mental plight? Say something specific about one of those things and get rid of the other two. Maybe in the way that you deconstruct mental deterioration, you include the word purity, right? But again, don't list them or say and, show how they're connected. That's going to help you say something more substantive about one of those particular things. And I don't mean to come off harsh or overly critical. I'm trying to be specific as I can with my feedback here so that you can really see all of the pieces here that go into having a more sophisticated response, all of the tweaks you can make. Plath showcases the empowerment of her psychosis in pursuing her hedonic pleasure and escapism from patriarchal oppression, subverted by enabling thereby provoking. Oh my goodness. It's impossible to follow that. And that is an example of just being too wordy, just being too excessive with it. You're not being clear enough. Dare I say, the point is probably not clear to you. It's not clear to the student here because we've chucked in all these buzzwords and big words and it might sound impressive. And I'm not saying it's not a strong response overall here because there are some really positive elements to it, but you're not going to fool a very experienced marker here by using a lot of big words. Okay. And that's key, right? And I want to say that in a gentle way, more gentle than I perhaps said it, but it's something that a lot of students feel they have to do to get a big mark, whereas it's probably taken away from the big mark here, unfortunately. Okay. The amount of listing, the amount of excessive big words obfuscates. There's a big word, obfuscates. It blurs, it distorts what you're actually trying to say. I just want a nice clean point here. It was sounding great at the beginning. It showcases the empowerment of her psychosis. That's an interesting point. Like I'm interested in that point. In pursuing her hedonic pleasure. Okay. End escapism. Ooh, diluted. Immediately the double up issue because you've got her hedonic pleasure and escapism. So let's figure out, you don't have to cut that one out. Figure out what one you want to go with. Make sure you're being specific enough. Subverted by enabling. I feel like we need to subvert that one and get rid of it. Thereby provoking, and I've cut Hughes to defensively reconstruct, just to be a bit sharp here and say, thereby provoking Hughes's defensive reconstruction of that narrative within his poetry. Now, to me, this is the perfect point to end the paragraph. As long as you've got at least 3 pieces of evidence that have been analyzed above, that to me is a beautiful link sentence. But you then have another link sentence. You have 2 link sentences. Don't even worry about merging these two. After reading that one again, I mean, just end it there. The reason why that's a beautiful link is that you've set yourself up for the next paragraph where you're going to mainly talk about Hughes. You've already said it provokes his defensive response, and then you go straight into your topic sentence of the next paragraph and talk about what that response is. What is Hughes's reconstruction there? That's exactly what a link should do. It should connect back to the question, but also link and lead into the next paragraph. That's what a perfect link sentence does. So to me, you would end it there. Save up this for later. This is more vague. You're detracting from the quality of this one because you say, to which Hughes evokes a response. You haven't even told me what type of response there. Here, I know it's a defensive response. I know he's defensive about it. And then you're going to tell me what that reconstruction looks like in the next paragraph. So let's cut that one out. You do not want to have 2 sentences in a row that sound like link sentences because neither of them actually have a quote in there. So hopefully that makes sense. I hope that helps you guys improve your writing no matter what you're looking at. I should note as well that if that helped, depending on when you're seeing this, we run workshops intermittently throughout the year, often in the June-July break. So if you're seeing this before June-July, the July holidays, before trials, and if you're looking at this and you're in year 12, and you want to come to workshops to do with some of these texts that you're studying as part of the HSC, if you want help with general essay writing skills, if you want help with short answer responses, if you want help with texts like The Crucible, 1984, Tempest Hagseed, T.S. Eliot's poetry, specific texts, we're basically going to do what we're doing here for a very small group of students over the course of a day to basically get those essays to a band 6 level. We're going to help you improve them. We're going to pick out all of the potential weaknesses in your responses. We're going to help you draft them up if you haven't even drafted them by that stage. And we're going to make sure that you know how to adapt to any unseen question on the day, whether that's for the craft of writing, essays, short answers. So make sure you check out the link in the description below if you're interested in coming to our workshops, where I personally will be there full day on each of these specific texts that we're doing. And we're going to take you through it and help you improve your writing. So thank you so much for participating here today. I will see you in the next one.